Thank you, Dr. Shagalow, for being here.
Shakayach, thank you very much. Thank you. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here tonight. I want to thank the people who organized this, Rabbi Reichik, who reached out to me, Mr. Hach, and I think I'm staying by the Kagans, and I'd like to thank them for hosting me. That is a beautiful place to stay. And I also want to thank you. The fact that you are all here tonight shows your dedication and your commitment to this and to the chinuch of your children. And I think that you deserve the biggest yasher koyach for coming out tonight to be so we can discuss and talk about these things which are so important, which involve all of us. When I agreed to come here, I was told that the evening would be at 7:30 Lubavitch time, 8 o'clock. What I didn't realize was that Minnesota time, that's 10 o'clock at night. So I'm not as fresh as I would like to be, but I will do my best. And the more questions you ask will actually keep me up. So please feel free to ask questions after we finish talking. I have been giving this talk, or different versions of it, over the last few years in different places. I began talking about it in Ole Torah about 4 or 5 years ago. I gave a talk about internet safety. I was asked to come and speak by Rabbi Deitch, who runs Ole Torah at the time. And I was glad to come and speak at that session. Spoke to parents about the internet and things like that. And since then, I've spoken in 4 or 5 other places. Just recently, I spoke at Must, an organization by women in Crown Heights, an amazing organization. And I was quite inspired to see that, and I'll repeat what I said then, that we are struggling today with our children, with the internet, smartphones, and how to educate our children on how to deal with this issue. And it's something which I see in my office constantly. It's one of the biggest issues I'm struggling with, whether it's with adults, couples, teenagers, young boys. The internet is becoming such a big issue nowadays, how to use the internet in a healthy way. But I was asked about 1.5 years ago by Mrs. Morozov, to speak for the Must organization. And I kind of smiled to myself as she started to talk to me on the phone. I thought it was a joke listening to her. And I said to her, I don't think I'm able to talk. For some reason, I just didn't think it was serious. 1 year later, she asked me if I would come to talk. I went down there and I saw the organization in action. And I will tell you, this is the most amazing organization. A group of Lubavitcher women got together and they decided to do something about the proliferation of the internet. I was under the assumption that this would be an impossible task, that what they were trying to do was very unrealistic and that they were dreaming. But these were serious women who got together and realized that if something needed to be done, if something could be done, it would be the women who would get it done. And they got together and they created this organization, very realistic. They had real goals about how to educate the community about technology, and they are doing an amazing job. I have nothing to do with them except for the fact that I was asked to come and speak for their organization. But I will tell you, it is an amazing organization. And if you have the ability to invite them to come and speak, I'm telling you, it would be a great, oh, they've already come here. Okay, well, so I just want to give a yasher koach to them. They do an amazing job. And so let's start at the beginning. As Mr. Hach mentioned, I've been working as a therapist since 2000. And I did this with a bracha from the Rebbe. I was a teacher in Lubavitcher Cheder, then I taught in Torah Academy. And then I got involved went to school in the evenings while I was a teacher. And I slowly progressed and I moved out to becoming a psychologist and working full-time in the area of psychology. On Shabbos, I still run a minyan. For those of you who remember the old days, I run a minyan we have a nice Chabad shul, and we run a minyan Shabbos, and Sunday we have a minyan by us. So it's busy, usually seeing clients from about 10, 11 in the morning till about 6, 7 o'clock at night usually about 8 clients a day. My practice is divided about 50-50 right now between the general community. And when I say the general community, I mean non-Jewish people or people from the general Minneapolis area who come to me through insurance. And the other 50% are Chabad, Lubavitcher families, people, single bochrim, girls, whether it's have to do with yeshiva, school, shidduchim, couples who are dealing with couples issues, relationship issues, mental illness and things like that around the world. Just last week, this Thursday, I spoke to a couple in Ukraine, a Lubavitcher couple, not shluchim, young couple married, living in a small town, the western side of Ukraine. Very sad story. I was talking to them and asking them about whether they plan to leave. Unfortunately, the husband can't leave because he's over 18. And I think the law in Ukraine is anybody who's over the age of 18, every male over the age of 18 until 60 is required to stay in the country, to pick up arms and to be conscripted into the army if necessary. And so he's not able to leave the country and his wife is not going to leave without him. And so he has to stay there. But he said to me that he's sure that the war will not make it to the western side of Ukraine. Unfortunately, it has made it there, but hopefully the Eibishter will hear his words and the war will come to an end soon. Anyway, so my point with that is that I'm talking to people all over the world, Eretz Yisrael, England, France, all over. And we are, everybody, wherever they are all dealing with the same issues. That is in the Jewish community. The myth is that somehow this issue of technology is just a Jewish issue. It's not. The technology in general and how to manage technology is a problem for everybody. I work with people who are not Jewish and they're struggling with the same issue. I have a client who is 14 years old. He's in 8th grade or 9th grade in public school in Buffalo, Minnesota, a small town. He's on the football team. And this is a kid who loves football since the age of 6. I spoke to him on Zoom. That's who I see all my clients now, only on Zoom because of COVID. And we're still in Minnesota, still operating under COVID restrictions. And so I see my clients on Zoom. I've been working with him now for about 6 months. He is a kid who loves football. His whole life centers around football. When I spoke to him on Zoom, he was sitting by a desk, holding a football in his hands. This is how much he loves it, throwing it, playing with it. This kid can do with a football, which I've never seen in my life, what he can do with a football. Why was he referred to me? The coach of the football team referred him to me because he has a policy. His policy is that if a kid has a smartphone, they cannot join the football team. This is the policy in Buffalo, Minnesota. You want to join the football team, you cannot have a smartphone. And I asked him, why not? He said, because it's just something I've noticed. I have seen the kids who have a smartphone, they are distracted, they're not able to concentrate, and their minds are just not available to play. They just don't have the same energy. They don't have the same commitment. And I said to him, so do you really think that none of the boys on the team have football, have cell phones, smartphones? And he said to me, look, doctor, he says, I know that the kids have smartphones, but I have if I don't see, don't tell. If I don't see the smartphone, I don't make a big deal out of it. But this kid who I'm sending to you, he's an addict. He said he's on his smartphone and I can see it's affecting his concentration. And because of that, I caught him with a smartphone. He needs to get help. So this is an issue which is affecting everybody, that smartphones in general are stealing away the attention of a football player, a kid who loves playing football. Today, his football is suffering because he has a smartphone. This is when it comes to something as simple as football. How much more so for our children, where we're trying to inculcate them with Hasidus, we're trying to inculcate them with Yiddishkeit, we are trying to create a world for them, we're trying to raise them in a world of Yiddishkeit, and when they have access to a smartphone, what it's doing to them, how it is affecting them. So just want to make that point to you. So that's why I'm here to talk about this. This has become an issue for me as I see this continuing, not only in 14-year-olds, I see it in 18-year-olds in yeshiva, I see it later on in adults. When I work with couples, it used to be that the divorce rate was maybe 2, 3, 4% in our community. Now it's getting up towards 15%. And this is often because of people having smartphones and not knowing how to use them effectively. I know that's not the main issue of tonight, but it's part of it. And so I want to bring that up. And so I'm happy to be here. But the main issue I was asked to talk about is talking to children about sexuality. The main question was how to talk to our children about sensitive topics, specifically about their bodies and about sexuality. And I think this is important, and it's especially important because of our generation. Because nowadays, more than ever, if we do not talk to our children about these topics, it is guaranteed that they will find it out from somewhere else. And when they find it out from somewhere else, they will also find it out and make assumptions about these things which are so important to us. They are so powerful, and there's so much kedusha involved in them. They're the basis of Jewish life. It's called taras hamishpacha, the purity of the family. And if we do not talk to our children about it, they will find out about it in other places. And that's why it's important for us to talk about it. What happens when they find out about it in other places? They invariably always find out things or see things which are wrong, which are not true. These things are exaggerated, etc. I don't have to go into explain all of these things. They are finding out wrong information, number one. Number two, when we do not talk to our children about these issues, they start to believe that they cannot share it and it's private. And there's a secret about this information. And because they believe it's a secret, it's private, either they joke about it as a way to release the tension, or they don't say anything about it, and they walk around full of trauma simply for having seen or heard these things, which they've seen. Or number two, they walk around with trauma because as they develop, they start to think that there's something terribly wrong with them. This is a topic which is not talked about. They're finding out that their bodies are growing, their minds are changing. They see that the interests and the urges are going in certain directions, especially boys. And they start to wonder that there must be something wrong with them because something is happening to them and nobody is explaining to them what is going on. And they're hearing information from this one and from that one. And what they don't hear from us, they're picking up from other people. I think also, when we talk to our children, we are making a connection with our children and we are opening up communication with them. It is true that if we want to have a conversation with our children about something so intimate, it is important to understand that the conversation doesn't begin there. It has to start earlier. When people ask me, how do I talk to my child about sex? The real question is, how are you talking to your child in general? Are you having any conversation with your child? If we're not talking to our children in general, we won't be able to talk to them about this. And so one of the things which is so important is learning to have a conversation with our children, especially boys. Boys are notoriously hard to talk to. I'm sure all of you at some point in your lives, mothers especially, when your child comes home and you ask the child what happened in school, and their answer is nothing or something like that. That's exactly what I do when I came home. My father asked me, what did you learn in school? And I said, nothing. And he said, you really learned nothing? And I said, yeah, we learned nothing. And my father just didn't have the courage to continue. He didn't have the skills and he left me alone. And that was exactly how I wanted it. I wanted my father not to bother me. And so he didn't bother me. But as a result, I had no real relationship with my father either. My father didn't know how to have a relationship with me. One of the most important things our children want is a relationship with their parents. They may not show that to us. They may not project it to us. They may look like they're not interested, but the truth of the matter is when you work on that relationship with your boys and your girls, that relationship will develop. It doesn't happen overnight. Some of your children, they will talk back to you right away. They'll chew your ear off. And some of your children just won't say a word. And it's going to take practice to ask them over and over again. Sometimes you have to ask very clear questions. Who did you see in school? What was the funnest thing you did in the classroom? What was the most saddest thing which happened? What was the weirdest thing? Did anybody make a joke? What did you eat? What happened on the playground? And as you start asking your children these fundamental questions, basic questions over and over again, you'll be surprised. After a while, your children will be waiting to talk to you. Why do I bring this up? Because if you want to have a conversation with your children about serious topics, you're not going to be able to have it if there isn't a communication connection developed first. So let's go back to the conversation, how to talk to our children about sensitive topics. So in general, I have found, and I also want to mention over here that there's an organization called Guard Your Eyes in New York. And as I was talking to parents and talking to children more and more about this issue, I wanted to see what else was out there. And there's a fellow called Mendy Elishevitz. I want to mention his name. He's part of Guard Your Eyes. He's a Lubavitcher Chassid. And he helped develop a, together with some professionals, curriculum. And I'm actually quoting from some of that curriculum. However, I take a slightly different approach. But if anybody is interested, you can go on to Guard Your Eyes. And they have handouts for parents how to talk to your children about sensitive topics. And a lot of what I will be talking about today can be found in those handouts over there. So that's a great resource to go to get information. I have found that there are three basic topics which we need to talk to our children about in this area. The first one I call safety, which is just simply talking to your child about basic safety, which is that their body is their own and nobody has a right to touch their bodies. There are books about this you can buy, Fruma books already. You go out and forget the name of the books at 10:15 at night, but they are available and you can read them with your children. They're made colorful books. Has anybody seen those books? What's that? Private Places. There's a couple of them already, which I've seen, which I have. And they are great books to start to bring up the topic with your child. That conversation starts from the day you have your child leave your home and you're not watching your child. That can be 5, 6 years old. If you're sending them away to day camp, you're sending them away to a place where you know there's an adult who you don't know who'll be there. We need to start talking to our children about this conversation. And that conversation is very simple. Very basic. It's a safety conversation. Nobody has a right to touch you. Nobody has a right. It's your body. Nobody has a right to touch you, especially not to pick you up, and especially not to touch you in a place which is private. If your body is covered, nobody has a right to remove your clothes or to touch you in a place which is private. And if they do, don't be afraid, but get away from them or speak to somebody who you trust and tell them what is going on. Come to me. Now, the important part is, the fact of the matter is, we know from research that unfortunately, most of the time, that doesn't work. And the reason why it doesn't work is because abusers are most often people who already know the child. And so when we say to a child that don't let any stranger touch you, they assume it means a stranger who they don't know. But if it's somebody who's close to them, then they think they they become more uncomfortable. So I think it's important that we tell our children at the age of 4 or 5, doesn't matter who it is, they cannot touch you. I have grandchildren, 5 grandchildren, and I know that I will not touch them, or I will not hug them or pick them up unless I get permission from their parents. This is important. It's not so much because of me, but because if I can pick them up, and if I pick them up and they get used to me picking them up, what's going to happen when somebody else wants to pick them up? And we need to be careful about this. I'm not saying that everybody's an abuser. Fortunately, abuse doesn't, well, I shouldn't say that. Most of the time, people are not abusive, but because when it happens, it is so traumatic and is so dangerous, it is important for us to teach our children to be careful. And if they say no, they need to know that that is trustworthy. I just got a call today in the airport from a kindergarten teacher, a little kid complaining, 3-year-old complaining, telling the mother that somebody did something to them in the kindergarten, a kindergarten girl, that somebody had done something to her. This was not a stranger. This was an assistant who had done something to her. So we're talking about that young age. Is that something which is preventable by speaking to our children? No. But what is preventable, the next part was that she came to her mother and she told her mother that this had happened. And when her mother asked her, this story happened today. And when the mother said to her, what did the teacher say? And the teacher said, don't worry, nothing happened. This is what the teacher said to the little girl. So this is happening. The interesting thing, the attendant was not a male, the attendant was a female. And so what really happened over there, we do not know yet. I do not know for sure, but I believe that 3-year-old girl was pretty specific about what occurred, and it wasn't comfortable, wasn't nice. The sad part about it is the parent said to me, does my child need to go to therapy? Does she need help? The fact of the matter is that a 3-year-old girl is not going to benefit much from therapy, especially not from talk therapy. And I don't believe that she'll benefit much from play therapy either. I think this girl will most likely forget about it, but when she turns 14, 15, 16 and starts to develop, and then she becomes aware of herself, that's when the seed of trauma, which was planted at the age of 3, will start to affect her. When she turns 15, 16, and then the memories of that will start to affect her. And it's even possible that it might affect her even earlier than that. Fortunately, it seems like it only happened once, twice, and she'll likely forget about it as soon as the parents tell her that this is wrong, people shouldn't be touching you, etc. Just telling her this is wrong and giving her the proper information, which a 3-year-old needs to know. But the reason I say this is because it's important we need to know this. I'm not trying to scare you. I am trying to prepare you. This is something we need to know. Same thing applies when our children go away to camp. We need to tell our children when you go to camp, it doesn't matter who it is, are the boys, are the girls, they should not be touching you in private places. They should not be trying to talk to you about things which are inappropriate. These are things we need to tell our children. And when we say to them, and if you have any concerns, ask us, talk to us. Can you hear me? Okay. We need to be able to be very straight with our children to talk to them about this. I spoke to a specific parent who told me that when he sends his boys away to overnight camp, which unfortunately, sometimes that's a place where these kind of things happen, he tells his children, it doesn't matter who it is, if it's a person with a black hat, with a beard, a Lubavitcher Bocher, whoever it is, it makes no difference. Nobody has a right to touch you. Nobody has a right to touch you in a private place or to ask you to do something or to show you parts of your body which are usually covered, or to do anything which makes you feel uncomfortable with your body, especially if it's in private. If they tell you it's a secret, you need to speak to somebody. Go over to somebody else and speak to them. Unfortunately, again, even though it doesn't happen that often, but it does happen on a regular basis. It happens in overnight camps, it happens in day camps, and we need to be careful. And it's a good thing when boys and girls know that they can speak up about it and they are warned about it, then they know how to respond. And it works. Unfortunately, one time I had to deal with a person who was himself an abuser. I typically don't work with people who are abusers themselves. I work mostly with people who themselves have been victims of abuse. But there are times when you work with, I work with somebody who's been, has a pattern of abuse, simply because we know that people who themselves abused sometimes become abusers themselves, since it's become normalized for them, which is a sad fact, because we sometimes think of the abuser as somebody who is terrible person, but so the abuser is often a victim of abuse themselves. That's why it's so important for us, again, to understand this, the danger of abuse. So the point is that we need to tell our children this from the age of 4 and 5, and always when we are sending them away to camp, when we are letting them go, just a short reminder, remember, wherever you're going, be careful, make sure that people are not ask you to do anything which is inappropriate. And if it is, you can talk to me or you can talk to so-and-so, and let them know that they can talk to people and trust them if they talk to you. Because if they say something happened, and the minute you say that can't be, even if it's somebody who is close to you, the message they get is they can't talk to you. It is important to know that abuse happens most of the time by somebody close to the person who's to somebody close to the victim. And that's why it's so important for us to talk to children. So again, what is the age for that? 4, 5, 6. And when kids go off to camp, to day camp and to overnight camp, I don't want to scare you. Camp is a healthy thing for our children. Overnight camp and day camp is a healthy place for our children. We can't protect our children from everything, but we can give them some basic tools. And this is one of those basic tools. Just speaking to them directly and telling them nobody has a right to touch your body or touch in private, especially boys who go to mikveh. That's even more important to tell them that. I personally think that young boys up to a certain age, 10, 11, should usually go with a parent, not go alone, because of those kind of issues. Number one. Number two, the issue of their bodies changing. This is the second step of talking to our children about sexuality. Our children are developing, and typically boys and girls start to hit puberty anywhere between the ages of 9 and 13, depending boys and girls, around those ages. And at those ages, the body naturally, the sexual urges, or what you call them, just the puberty turns on. Children become aware of their bodies. They don't only become aware of their bodies, they become aware of the other gender. Or they become aware, they start to feel sexual issues at the ages from 9 until 13. It's usually closer to 12. For boys, for girls, it can be a little bit earlier, and they become aware of themselves. What we want is we want parents to be talking to their children just before this happens, so that when their bodies start to change, they don't become uncomfortable and they don't start seeking information or engaging in activities or starting to believe that there's something wrong with them. This is when the problems begin. When a child reaches the age of, let's say, 12 and 13, their body starts to change and nobody explains to them what is going on. They need to understand what's going on, simply from a biological perspective. What is happening to them? Why is their body changing? Why is their body, what is happening to them? Both physically, things are happening to them, which is that body is changing. They need to know, for example, that they're going to start to grow. They have hair growing in specific places. for boys, that the bodies are going to change and they're going to grow hair in different places. And for girls, the same thing. They need to know this information. They know that they're going to start sweating differently and they may have to start wearing deodorant. We need to tell this to our children very simply. You know, you're now turning 12. You're becoming a man. You're becoming a woman. I don't have the opportunity to talk to girls who are developing that way, but you know the conversation to have. The important part is that we have this conversation with them. We do not be afraid of it. I think one of the issues which I come across is we as parents are scared or afraid of talking about these things. And I think the notion is that if we talk to our children about it and we tell them about this, they will somehow, we will trigger in them and we'll get them to think about things and maybe trigger them a little bit too early. I can assure you that that is not the case. You can talk to your children openly about what's happening to them. You will not be triggering them about anything. This is, if they are too young to understand, they probably will not even remember the conversation. And if they're old enough to understand, they will listen very intently. This is information they need to know. Very simple things, like I said, physical growth. Their bodies are going to change. Their arms and their legs start to grow and they start to become a little bit more clumsy. Their voices change. They don't understand why that's happening. Different parts of their bodies are going to change. I had a boy in my office who was having anxiety attacks and took a while for me to figure out what was going on. And what was going on, this is how you can see how children complicate and confuse things. Kid is 11, 12 years old, and he was reaching puberty, and his chest was getting a little big on top. He was starting to feel pain in his chest. And so he was having panic attacks. He said to his parents that he wanted to speak to a therapist. He didn't tell him what it was about. He was concerned if he was gay because he had no idea about what was going on with him. And somehow, if his chest is growing, that must mean that he's a woman, and that must mean he's gay. The idea is how he came to that logic was so sad. And to explain to him, no, have this whole conversation about what's going to happen to him. That's a simple example of how kids make mistakes. What would happen to that kid if he couldn't speak to somebody like me? Or what happens if he was uncomfortable talking to his own parents about it? He was afraid to talk to them about it. If he would have had a conversation with his parents, they would have told him about puberty, what it's like, what happens to your body. What would have happened if he couldn't talk to somebody? What he would have thought about himself? He would have been in yeshiva. He would have started to believe that yeshiva is not a place for him because there's something wrong with him, etc., etc. This is why it's so important for us to share basic pieces of information. Children are having other things happening to them. For girls, they're having their periods. For boys, they're starting to have erections. They're starting to have kishui. These are things which are natural. They happen to our children. We cannot pretend that they're not happening and that our children are worried about them. It's interesting who should have this conversation with the children. I would typically say that women should have the conversation with the girls and men should have the conversation with the boys, but it doesn't always work out that way. Fortunately, for some reason, sometimes the men are too embarrassed. In general, I think for girls, women, mothers should have this conversation. And for boys, fathers should have the conversation. But it's still better if a father's not willing to have this conversation, for mothers to read up on this and to have this conversation with your boys. If for some reason the father's not able to have the conversation, or for some reason it's not happening, it's still an okay thing, I believe, for mothers to have this conversation. I was having a conversation with a cheder today, and the cheder was discussing how to possibly bring in this conversation into the curriculum. And my understanding is that they're working on this as a possibility, and I think it's a great idea. When I was a teacher in 6th and 7th grade in Torah Academy, I personally was part of I think it's something I forgot to mention when we spoke today, When I was a seventh grade teacher, I was already going to school in the evenings, and the school decided to have a conversation about puberty with the boys and with the girls. And what they did was a very wise thing. They brought in a pediatrician. Did I mention that? They brought in a pediatrician and a Rabbi. And the pediatrician just talked about the physical aspects of puberty, what was going to happen to them, what they could expect. And then the Rebbe spoke to them about the religious part of it, the spiritual parts of it, about the idea of Shmer Sinayim, watching your eyes, and recognizing that the struggle is normal. You're going to turn 12, 13. Not only are you going to grow physically, but you're going to grow emotionally. You're going to start recognizing the opposite gender. You're going to start finding yourself uncomfortable or attracted to the opposite gender. That's all normal. You're going to feel it in your body. You're going to notice things happening to your body when you think about the opposite gender. At night, things will happen to you. There's something called semen. There's something called, in Hebrew, it's in Lashon HaKodesh, it's called zera. And that's not the same thing as urine, because this is another question which the boys want to know, what is going on, because this is something which is a common thing for them to happen. And I think mothers, this is something for you to know and to understand, because boys turn to their mothers faster than they turn to their fathers. And it's up to you to know that these things are normal, and they happen. Boys will often at night, their body will discharge semen from their bodies, simply an act. It's simply a process of developing which happens at puberty. Doesn't happen to everybody. I've got experiences where some people never happen to them. It's not because they are tzaddikim. It's not because they're Hasidic boys. It's simply because they are made differently. The Alter Rebbe even mentions it in Tanya. He says there are certain people who are mechumim b'tivoi, some people who are mekurer b'tivoi. We have associated something wrong with the child. This boy is talking about sexual things. This boy's got and interested in these things, and another boy is not. It's often more to do with biology and physiology than it has to do with anything ruchnistic. Some children are just going to develop differently than others, and they need to understand it. Some boys, some children will never have this problem, will never see anything. I've heard from certain boys who will tell me, not related to anything, that they will have a seminal discharge nearly every night. And they never understood what it was, why it was happening to them, and nobody told them that this was normal. It is normal, but they also have to understand at a young age that they've got to be careful, that this means they've got to watch where they go and what they see, because the more they see, they're more likely for it to happen. But they don't have to feel guilty about that. That is natural. This is the normal part of growing up. And this is a conversation we need to have with our children. At a later stage, we may talk to them more about that. This is the conversation we need to have with our children about these processes before they reach bar mitzvah. The nice thing is, again, I'm not speaking directly about girls because my experience is limited with girls, especially talking to younger girls. I happen to talk to girls who are older, 17, 18, 19, but except for my own girls at 3, for some reason, I was the one who had to talk to them about that. We have a tradition. We had a tradition that when the girls turned 12, I would take them to my parents in Eretz Yisrael for their bas mitzvah. My daughter's going to kill me that I'm saying this publicly. One of my daughters came with me, and I took her to Eretz Yisrael to see my parents for a week and a half. And she just happened to reach puberty while she was on that trip with me. All I can tell you was it was a horrible, horrible trip. She was in such a bad mood. But I was the one who had to explain to her what was going on. Of course, she had known already a little bit, but to go to the store and help her out. And this is something we need to do. We need to tell our children about this. So, what's that?
Can I go back?
Yes.
Going back to the conversation about like body parts and their body changing. I mean, like we will talk to our kids about it. private 808. But don't you think that the school, they're working on it, it's amazing, but growing up, like that whole subject is like class is always looked at out of our curriculum. Don't you think that it makes it a very like secretive topic when it's not spoken to the kids in school setting?
That's a very good question. I think the answer to that is simply an issue of liability, and schools have become concerned about talking about issues which parents might not be happy about them talking about. And I think teachers are also uncomfortable not trying to talk about it. That's a general conversation about how to bring it up. I also believe that the best way to bring this up is not just to sit down with your child and say to each other, okay, now we're going to talk about puberty, but to find opportunities when we can introduce these topics as the children are growing up. This is an ongoing conversation. It's not a one-time conversation. And I think we are scared of this topic, but we need to have this topic very practically and very pragmatically. For example, children need to know at a younger age, doesn't have to be at 12, 13, when they learn in Chumash, and it says, Vayishgav imo, and he slept with her, and he laid with her, and she became pregnant, or they learn the dinim of Tuma, and there's such a thing called Tumas Nida, Tumas Zav. These are times when we can gently bring up these conversations, these topics in the classroom. I think teachers need to be trained adequately how to do this, but specifically parents, it's a good idea for parents to talk about these issues, specifically how they relate to their child. And this is a great opportunity for parents to bring it up in the context of Yiddishkeit. So the children are hearing about these things as they learn in the Chumash. Of course, you don't want to say all of this to a 3, 4-year-old, but once they reach the age of 6 and 7, I think we're too scared of this. As long as we speak very, very down to earth and just the little bits of information which they need to hear. It's very interesting. The Torah doesn't say anything very graphic. The Torah says, for example, the story of Lot. The story of Lot says that she slept with her father. That's what it says. She lay with him. And you know what? That's what a child of 6, 7 needs to know. A child of 6 and 7 needs to know that for a woman to have a baby, that she needs to lay with her husband, and that's how they have a child. The specifics, they don't need to know at 6 and 7, those specifics, but that is enough, and often they don't ask any more questions. The point is that, I don't know about 6 or 7, but 8 or 9, we can share with our children a little bit of these little pieces of this information. By 12, 13, our children need to know about this information because they are going to find out about it for sure. So by the age of 12, this is the age children should know. Now, how exactly this is done, I think this is something which the school is concerned about. And after talking to Rabbi Greenbaum, it seems like the school is working on a way to be able to bring that into the classroom, possibly in 6th or 7th grade, figuring out what is a healthy way to do that. But I think parents, when they feel they're ready, should bring up this topic with their children. They should talk to them about it. Like I said, first conversation is what is happening to your body. One of the ways also to talk about it is to say, this is happening so that you're now capable of becoming a father. What we tell our children is that when you reach 12 or 13, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has created us with the power to procreate. To procreate means, like from the word create, just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates, because he's a Kadosh. The whole idea of procreation is Kedusha, is holiness, and the way it happens through the bris. That's why a person has a bris, because it's so Kadosh, and that's why we have to be careful with it. It's a very powerful thing. That's why it's tznius, and it's what creates the basis of our relationship. Our children are fascinated by these things and need to hear these things. And when they hear these things, they have an entirely different attitude about it. So the second conversation we need to have with our children, as I said, is physiology, what's happening to their bodies. And the third conversation, which needs to happen right after that, is the topic of intimacy. How do we bring up the topic of intimacy? Again, I believe the best way to bring it up is to bring it up from the Torah. We see it in the Torah over and over again in different things. the idea of Kedusha. And Kedusha, this is something which is private. Then a man and a woman get together and they have to sleep together to have a baby. And this is the basis of a holy relationship. And because it's so powerful, that's why at the same time, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us, HaKadosh Baruch Hu created, this is something which is a pleasurable thing, and it's a mitzvah for husband and wife to do. But as children, when we're younger and we don't have a wife, this is an avera. It's something which is not appropriate. It's not, as when you do not have a proper home and you don't have a father and a mother who are committed to each other and are willing to raise the children properly, then this is just a waste. That's why it's considered tumah, because you're taking something which is powerful, which is the ability to create, and you're using it for something which is just wasting, which is really something which is the basis of a marriage. What is interesting is I use this topic, I use this conversation, I use this language with 12, 13, 14-year-old boys all the time, and even with girls. And what is so interesting to me is that children take this very seriously, and it does not do what we think it will do to them, just the opposite. We don't need to be afraid of these things. Of course, when we have these conversations with our children, we need to preface it by saying to them, this is a private conversation. We're having this conversation with you because you're becoming an adult. It's about sneezdika things. And just like you don't show your private parts, so when we talk about things, you don't talk about your private parts. If it's supposed to be covered, you don't talk about it in public. Just like you don't show it in public, you don't talk about it in public. And that's also when you say to them that some kids like to joke about these things. Maybe their parents didn't teach them, or they don't know, or they pick up information in the streets and they make jokes about it and they laugh about it. But this is not something to laugh about. It's something which is serious, and it's a holy thing. And children listen to this conversation. We do not need to be afraid of it. Relationship is the most important part. Having a relationship with our children is the most important part of this conversation, that we talk to them on a regular basis. Fortunately, we live in a generation, we're having 9, 10 children, big families, and we don't have that much time. But the truth of the matter is, it isn't about quantity, it's about quality. And I think here it's important for me to talk about that it's not just about having this conversation, like I said earlier, but it's about connecting with our children on a regular basis. Even when they turn 12, 13, build up that relationship with your children. Keep talking to them. Some of us find it's easier to talk around the sefer, to learn with our children. Some of us will go outside and play baseball with our children or do something. It's not the amount of time, it's just the quality time, a few minutes a day which you have to talk with each one of your children. Maybe it's at bedtime, maybe it's in the middle of the day. If you're a busy father and you're working all the time, make a point to stop in the middle of work and go to the cheder and stop and ask the teacher that you want to talk to your child. Take the child out of class and just say to the child, I just wanted to say hello. These kind of things are so powerful to create a relationship, a connection with your children. We have this notion that if our children are quiet, that everything is okay. If they're doing well in school, everything is okay. And that's not always true. Sometimes those children suffer the most. They're called glass children. I don't know if you've heard of that notion, glass children. The idea of a glass child is the child who does everything perfect because there's a lot of stress going on in the house. And that person, a boy or a girl, will often make it their business to cause the least amount of stress because they're trying to stabilize the family. I can't tell you how many times, adults will tell me that they were the glass, they won't use the word glass child, but they were the child who, when they were growing up, did everything right. And the reason why they did everything right was because there was so much stress in the family that they took it upon themselves not to cause their parents any harm. And that becomes overwhelming for a child. So it's important for us, even those children who are doing well, to stop, to talk to them, make contact with them. So that is in a nutshell the issue of talking to our children about their personal development. We've covered that. The next issue people asked me about was about vaping and smoking and things like that. And I will say this, that as I spoke to the at school, as I spoke to in the Cheder, I personally have seen people who are vaping, but I don't see it to be a tremendous big problem. I've noticed that, and I'm just saying my observations, that yes, Bochrim are vaping, Bochrim are smoking, and they're doing those kind of things. It used to be smoking, now it's vaping, and sometimes they're vaping nicotine, and sometimes they're vaping marijuana, cannabis, whatever, and whatever form it comes in. And sometimes the kids are using gummy bears and things like that, which makes it a lot easier eating these things. This is a health issue. This is not a religious issue. But I want to say that statistically we know that the main reason why children or teenagers vape and smoke and drink is because of peer pressure, because others around them are doing the same thing. And that's another conversation which we just need to talk with our children. This is unfortunately one of those conversations. It's hard to tell our children to stop because they won't listen to us, but it is important for us to tell them what our values are. It is important for us as parents to say, I believe vaping is wrong. I believe smoking is wrong. It's dangerous for you. When do we have this conversation? Again, these conversations are usually had in a natural environment. When you see somebody smoking, if you read something, I made an issue always when I saw some news about a car crash, alcohol, make a point of sharing it at the table, that there was an accident, a family got killed, the boy was drinking alcohol or the girl was drinking alcohol, and that's how it happened. And the same thing with vaping. There's another issue which we need to be aware of when it comes to vaping and drinking alcohol, and that is that our children sometimes, or often, are self-medicating. And that's the reason why they're doing this. Children who engage in these kind of behaviors, sometimes they're doing it for social pressure, but another reason why they're doing it is because of self-medication. What are they self-medicating? Typically, social anxiety. They may be these kids who are difficult, having a hard time with social anxiety. By the way, back 20 years ago, it was a known thing that kids with ADHD would gravitate towards marijuana. Marijuana calms you down, depends which kind of marijuana you use, but marijuana calms you down, and it seems to help teenage kids slow their brain down and to start to experience what other kids feel like. And so it's important to recognize that if you're concerned about it, and if your children are engaging in this, now kids are going to be curious. They're going to do this once or twice. Kids drink at Farbrengens, they say l'chaim and things like that, and they drink, they hear about mashke and l'chaim. Interestingly, some kids will say l'chaim and will never turn into shikers. They'll never pick up the habit. They just don't want to drink. Other kids, for some reason, will pick up the habit and go crazy. Some of them will outgrow it in a year or two. Others will stick with it. But it's important for us just to talk about the facts. The facts are, by the way, about marijuana. It's an important thing to know is that, first of all, 20 years ago, there was about 4% THC in typical marijuana, which you bought. Nowadays, that number THC has gone up from 4% to close to 16, 17%. And in some plants, they've been able to bring it up to 20%. So when people talk about marijuana not being addictive, they may be talking about something which was 25, 35 years ago. Nowadays, marijuana can be pretty addictive, and yes, it can be addictive. Once upon a time, they said it couldn't be addictive, but we see factually that some people, even adults, do get addicted to marijuana. Another interesting thing about marijuana is that those kids who use it tend to drop a few IQ points. And this is something we can tell our children. I think it's important to share with them. It actually affects your ability to concentrate. It affects your long-term memory. Of course, if a child uses it once or twice, may not have that big of an effect, but consistent use of marijuana affects memory for long-term. It affects the ability for people to concentrate properly. And in some occasions, especially with today's marijuana, we have known that it triggers psychosis. Using marijuana can trigger schizophrenia in some people. And there's a higher rate of psychotic disorders among people who are chronic marijuana users. Originally, it was thought that people who have a propensity to mental illness are using this marijuana, and that's why it's happening. But there's been recent studies which have shown that when you factor that out, whatever that means, that simply extensive use of marijuana will cause some people to trigger in them serious and persistent mental illness like psychosis and schizophrenia. Or at least it will cause them to have psychosis. We also know that people who smoke marijuana regularly can have paranoia. And I'm sure some of you here know what I'm talking about. And when there was a time, I will admit, that as a bacher, somebody gave me some marijuana to smoke. And I think I suffered from paranoia for a week after that. And I thought I was just paranoid because I had smoked marijuana. But it turns out that chemically, it actually induces paranoia. And that can last for a few days, up to a week. The person can be under the influence of that emotional trauma. Please don't tell my wife that I said that here. She knows. So that's an important thing to understand. The conversation about these things is not something which you can yell at your child about. It's an open dialogue. Start to have these conversations earlier. Like I said, the best time to have these conversations is when you see it in the environment. For example, when you drive by and you see a sign and it says there, buy marijuana here, it's a good time to have a conversation with your children about it. Do you know about marijuana, what it is? Some people use it. Unfortunately, we believe that because it's illegal, therefore it is healthy, therefore it's not a problem. But it's not true. The reason why it's legal has nothing to do with whether it's healthy or not healthy. And it's not, again, this is not a Jewish problem. You can go online and you can find easily talking points about marijuana and the dangers of using marijuana. I personally see that just kids who are using it for curiosity's sakes, maybe use it once or twice and they won't continue to use it. Those kids who are using it because they are self-medicating, those are the ones who are using it regularly. And so if you have a problem with a child, and you think your child is using it regularly, it's a good time to sit down and maybe you haven't talked to somebody. It's very likely that they've got either a social anxiety going on, or they've got a generalized anxiety going on, or they may have some signs of depression or ADHD, which is undiagnosed, and they're using this as a way to cope. So one more thing I'd like to say. Another important thing about this is, how can we help our children so that they don't get in this in the first place? And it applies also to technology, which I didn't talk too much about, setting boundaries with technology, which I want to get to. And that is having a balanced life. So let me give me so that a little bit more time, I want to finish this. One of the questions was, how do we raise our children with technology so that they, on one hand, they do not become zombies, but on the other hand, they know how to use it responsibly. So what I believe is, first of all, I'm not against technology. I think technology is an amazing thing. For some of our kids, they can benefit tremendously from having access to the internet. Our kids are lively. Some kids get online. They can watch YouTube. They can see how to fix it videos and many different things which can be very helpful for children to keep them busy. The problem, however, is this notion that somehow our children will make wise decisions on their own. Our children cannot make wise decisions on their own, unfortunately, because the internet was designed, and especially smartphones were designed to be addictive. We know that. We know that all the big executives in Silicon Valley back in 5-10 years ago were talking about how they would not let their children own a smartphone because they know and they paid their technologists and their engineers to make these tools, to make these phones addictive. Their size, the way they're shaped, the apps which are on there are all designed to be addictive. So please do not say that my child is going to, on their own, be able to use this phone wisely. We can't use them wisely. Let us use technology to fight technology. So number one, you want your children to have this technology. You want them to grow up, to know how to use it wisely. Set some limits for them. Don't have them set their own limits. We have technology today which filters smartphones, which filters your computer at home. Put that on your computers. Put that on all your devices. A device at home which is unprotected, especially for boys, is like honey for a bee. You put honey, a bee will find it. A child, if you have a device at home which is unprotected, your child will find it. It is difficult, but you need to do it. If there's a piece of technology, an old phone, which you don't use anymore, throw it out. If you have a home computer, if you have your own computer, your own smartphone, put a password on it and change that password every day. Not every day, I mean, change it regularly. Why? Because your children will do whatever they can to get that phone, figure out your password, wake up in the middle of the night and use it. And that's exactly what happens all the time. So what can you do? First of all, be a dugma chaya. For yourselves, have times when your technology is available and have times when the technology is not available. There was a study done and it was found that teenagers and kids today spend less time outdoors than maximum security prisoners in jail. Our children spend less time outdoors on average than maximum security prisoners. They are given, 1 hour a day outside? Do your children spend an hour outside a day? No. So this is about creating a balance. It's not only about protecting the children from the internet, it's having them other things to do. How much time should your child be on the computer? Ask yourself. Homework, 45 minutes before they go to sleep. They should not be watching because it interferes with sleep. And an hour a day, no more than an hour a day, typically, except on a Sunday or times when they don't have school, they may be on it a little bit more. And have times when it automatically shuts off. Use the technology to shut off at certain times. The same thing, parents. You are a dugma chaya. When it comes to supper, make sure that you put your phones off or just leave the phone, the ringer on. They are learning from you. By the way, they're learning from you when it comes to internet use. Have a policy, for example, that you leave your phones, that when your child asks you, why do I need to have a filter? You're able to say to them, not only why do you need a filter, but why do I need a filter? The easiest thing for me was to talk to my child. When I explained to my child, he said to me, why do I need to have a filter? Why can I only go to certain sites? And I would be able to say to my son that I don't go on the computer alone. I have a policy in my house. I have a little bit of ADHD. And when I have a computer in front of me, I go on and get distracted. And sometimes I end up in places I don't want to go. And so I have a rule in my house. I will not go onto a computer unless it has a filter. My wife has a filter on her computer. She has a password on the phone. My daughters have a filter on the phone and they know. So when my son says to me, why can't I go online? I say to him, I don't like to go online either. It's not healthy for me. It's not healthy for you. This is what a Fruma Yid does. He protects himself. So be role models for your children when it comes to computer use. Let them see from you. Just like, by the way, when it comes to marijuana use, we're a little concerned about our children using marijuana. To our children, marijuana is no different than alcohol. And if we sit in Fabring and get drunk on Shabbos afternoon, then to them, there's no difference between alcohol and between marijuana. So therefore, they also believe that, our parents drink alcohol because that's what they're used to. Our generation, eats gummy bears. It's another way to do it. So we need to be role models for our children when it comes to these things. They are learning from us that it's okay to take mood altering drugs and things like that. We need to set examples for them. Any other questions?
Yeah, a lot of good questions came in. Obviously, there's time restraints, so I'll just do the best I'm able. So you mentioned you don't pick up your grandchildren unless you get permission from their parents. Is that really necessary? Don't you feel that society has gone overboard in this area? When I was growing up, it was a normal thing for an older person to pinch my cheeks. I didn't feel comfortable at all. Now we're asking permission to hug and kiss our grandchildren.
Yes, we are going overboard. I do believe that. We are going overboard. In a normal house, but I'm sure you're picking up your grandchildren. There's some kind of unspoken agreement between your children about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So when I say I asked my children permission to pick up my grandchildren, I don't mean every single time. I mean, in general, that my child will say, my daughter will say, once the child reaches 4 years old, please don't pick him up. Or after 5 years old, don't pick him up. And that's something to respect. I think it's important for us to respect. The problem is not, we say going overboard. If you trust your relationship with your children and you feel that they are safe, it's up to each parent to decide how they want to do that. I'm not saying that parents have to not let grandparents pick up their children. If they feel it's okay, then it's okay. However, I think if you want your child, by the way, children are not that comfortable being picked up. I think this is it's a bit of a myth. Some children like to be picked up. A lot of children don't want to be picked up. They just don't want to. And some of my grandchildren don't want me to pick them up. They just don't like it. They're 6 years old and I want to pick them up and they don't like it. So I do think it's a wise thing to ask their parents if it's okay to pick them up. What's that?
Ask the child.
You ask the child. You ask the child too. But it's not only asking the child. I'm a grandparent, so if my daughter tells me that's okay to pick up the child, I know it's okay to pick up the child. She will say to me at a certain age, please don't pick up the child for that age. It's not my business to pick up that child. If she says to me, she doesn't want me to pick up the child. I think that's important because when we do that, we are teaching the child that it's okay for somebody to pick you up and you don't have a say in the matter. So yes, ask the child. But I also think we do need to ask parents also, especially in today's day when people become sensitive. Is it overdone? It's overdone, but still I think it's still necessary for us to talk to parents and to have their okay.
Thank you very much for that. This kind of ties into our next question. Again, we're going through a lot of different elements of what we discussed this evening.
Sure.
What would you suggest in the following situation? Your child's Rabbi or teacher is extra nice to your child, and as a parent, something feels off because we have so much knowledge and awareness nowadays. I believe we can possibly feel worried for no reason, but also not sure how to navigate this if as a parent, I do feel like my child is shown extra attention from a Rabbi or a teacher.
I was speaking to a Rav in a certain community who said to me that, he says, I used to see a kid in shul, I used to give him a pinch on the cheeks. He says, I will never do that anymore, pinch a kid on the cheeks. How do we navigate that? So most of the time, again, I want to make a point over here that most of the time, abuse is not happening. And parents and teachers are being nice to our children, maybe even putting the hand around the child or something like that. And there's nothing harmful in that. But if we are uncomfortable, I think that nowadays teachers need to know that it's okay if a parent is concerned to raise it with a principal or to raise it with a teacher and say, I'm a little bit uncomfortable, and have maybe a principal to talk to, and the principal can check into that and find out what's going on. I think there needs to be a medium, a way for parents to have a process to be able to check that out, to find out if something strange is going on. And even if nothing is going on, if a parent feels it's uncomfortable, I think a parent needs to be able to point that out to the school. It's okay for the school to then have a conversation with the parent. Sometimes it can be basic information. I think the kind of things which people generally do in public is typically okay for a teacher to do a child. Putting your hand around a child for a moment is not the end of the world. That's something which people generally do in public. If it happens on a regular basis, it is a good idea sometimes to help that teacher understand that you don't want that to happen.
Thank you. Switching gears a little bit. Do you believe we have an issue with Bachram drinking alcohol in the school environment and using it as an escape and it eventually becoming addictive and thus affecting marriages and families? And what could be done from an administrative standpoint? I know that's a broad question.
I do believe we have somewhat of a problem. And there are yeshivas, different yeshivas. I work with different yeshivas and I know there's different cultures. And yes, this is a bit of a problem. Most of the time it dissipates by the time the boys reach a certain age, but there are a few diehards where it remains a problem. And what can we do about this? That's a tough thing what to do. Certain yeshivas are making very strict rules about alcohol, but there's a subculture, the young boys in the Masifta. One boy says, he has no idea what he's doing. And he says, I'm the one who provides the mashke for the Fabrengens, and he collects money from the boys in Shir Beis in Masifta, and he's buying vodka and he's giving it out to the boys. He's a tzaddik boy. He thinks he's accommodating a Chiddush Fabrengen. But boys are learning to drink at that. Are all the boys becoming shikarim because of that? No. I think, again, this is something we as parents have to be concerned about. And most of the children do not pick this up, but some of them do. What can we do about it? We can continue to talk to our children about alcohol and explain to them that it's a bad habit, and introduce this conversation to them before they go to yeshiva, talking to them about it. What can the Naholas do about it? They're trying their best. Unfortunately, everything which we put, which we restrict, the boys, and unfortunately, just go in the opposite direction. As it says, "Mein genuvin yimtaku." When the Anhola says we're not going to have alcohol, the boys are going to be boys. They're going to do these kind of things. They're going to do it. I think parents need to have conversations. Parents need to be dugmachayas. If they're watching their parents get shikar on Shabbos afternoon, they're going to, somebody else getting shikar on a regular basis, they're going to think it's cool too, and they're going to want to do it too. And I think as they watch, as parents do, so the children do. Is that all the time that way? Not necessarily, but as the community does, that's how the children do. By the way, I want to say something else interesting about alcohol, that my experience is that whenever, in yeshiva specifically, whenever there is abuse, or whenever there is extreme behavior with boys, it is unfortunately after Fabrengens. That's a time when because when boys are drinking a lot, they are not as they don't have the same self-control, and that's when trouble happens. Does that mean that you shouldn't drink in yeshiva? Absolutely not. But typically, what I mean by that, yes, you shouldn't. Boys at Bachram are going to drink 1 or 2 l'chaims, but Fabrengens should end at a certain time. And a lot of yeshivas are becoming aware of this problem, that the day after Fabrengens or the night after Fabrengens can be a pretty dangerous time for some of the boys in yeshiva. They're drinking, they've said l'chaim, they've lost their inhibition, and certain hanolas are very careful, making sure that if Fabrengen ends at a certain time, the boys are in bed, they get up at a certain time the next morning, so that there's some structure for the boys and they're not going wild.
A little bit of a different angle. I overheard my 8-year-old daughter's friend tell her about 2 women getting married is called gay. How do I address these new levels of society with young children? At what age do we discuss this with our children, and in what manner?
I knew I was going to get that question. First of all, I don't think, I think that's a reality, especially with kids who are, you may not see it here in LA as much because your children are in a cheder environment like this, but they're shluchim. Okay, but we see it in Minnesota. When we invite to home a couple, and the woman says, "Can I bring my partner?" You know, or we ask a guy, you know, put on tefillin. He says, "Can I invite my wife?" And we say, "For sure," you know. And then they show up at the Shabbos table, and he introduces his partner, a man. He says, "This is my wife," right? And you got 7-year-olds at the table. What do you tell them? Tell them exactly that. You know, they're not frum, and he's married to a man, and that's not something we do. And yes, and that's called gay. That's what else can we do? What else can we say? So it's a reality. They bump into it, and the answer is yeah. Some women marry women, and you know the bigger problem of why it's uncomfortable for me to talk about that is because we're starting to see this happen in our communities more and more, and I'm starting to see 13-year-old boys, 13-year-old girls who are coming into my office and identifying as gay. And I really don't know what to do about it that much. There are certain therapists and certain psychologists, former psychologists, who claim that whenever there is homosexuality in the Jewish community, it's always a sign of abuse. I happen to believe that most of the time that's true, but it's not true all the time. That there are cases, I don't know whether it's the water, whether it's chemicals, what it is, but kids from a young age who have told me that they have no interest in the opposite gender and they feel a physical attraction to the same gender. We need to make space for them in our community. I have nothing else to say. Why is it that a kid who goes off the derech, we're makar of them, we got to do something with these kids. We got to, you know, this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem, and I don't know the answer to it. But it's something which is out there. It's not that, I'm a psychologist, so I see maybe 1 in 100 boys, but I would say it's at least girls constantly. I mean, every year I have 3 or 4 of these cases where a kid is coming to me and telling me that from a young age, they have no interest in the other. My first question is, you know, you're interested in somebody of the same gender. Do you have any interest in the other gender? Absolutely not. Nothing. No interest whatsoever. And they're strongly attracted to the same gender. And work with them as much as I can to be able to normalize it. But I think it's okay for us to talk about it. I think we're a little too scared about all of this. A child who is not gay is not going to become gay by hearing this information. That's not going to happen. Our children already see things which are inappropriate. They see pictures of inappropriate things. Why are we scared? They see a guy and a girl who are not married living together. These are things they see. So they'll see this also. I think we're too afraid of this. We can tell our children, we don't do this. This is not a Yiddish thing. And usually that addresses the issue for most kids.
Interestingly, this is probably appears to be one of the easiest things we discussed this evening. You're saying it's a very simple conversation. It's not going to turn them.
It's definitely not.
Obviously in a tznius fashion or however the age appropriate, but it's not a very complex conversation.
I don't think it's a very complex conversation at all. I've never seen a boy decided he's gay because somebody told him that two men, because he saw 2 men together. That's not the way it works.
Is it easier to perhaps draw it down from like Badafka learn a Gemara that discusses these things specifically to make the conversation not normalized, but like, what do you mean? It's straight out of the Torah, and that way, and the Torah says no, etc. Meaning, is it easier in that way? Have you found that?
It's easier to. I have not found that for those kids who have a problem with it, it is not easier. For those kids who don't have a problem with it, you can just say like anything else, you know, they're not from, and they fall in love with whoever they want to. And, you know, they have no, the Torah says, man is supposed to marry a woman is supposed to marry a man. And, you know, they just marry whoever they want to. Simple as that.
Change the topic again.
From thing, when the person's from, it just complicates a lot more, so you can't just make it out there. You're saying it's in the from community.
Yes, that's true.
The terrorist says not to, but that person who's from a council show does it. You just can't make it from enough from me either.
Well, in a certain way you can, because the Torah also says that a man and a woman shouldn't sleep together unless they're married. And there's a lot of men and women who are around who are not married and they're not gay. So a child understands that just because he's interested up to a certain age. The child understands that, at least till marriageable age. As long as in yeshiva, there really is, well, there is a bit of a difference, but at least that language is helpful for a bacher or a girl who's struggling that, you know, nobody in yeshiva is having sex. So what's the difference if you're gay or not? It's not that simple, obviously. Boys do struggle and girls do struggle with their urges. It's a lot different. With the boys in the yeshiva, there's other boys around him and he's attracted to boys. That is true. But that is then a person, a child like that needs to be talking to somebody and getting help and getting support.
And
But that's something which is, like I said, a lot of, I've seen therapists who talk about it, prominent therapists who talk about it, and report about it as somehow having to do with abuse. Well, first of all, like I said, I found that it really has nothing to do with abuse. It's easy to go backwards and say, oh, there was abuse. But if you use that logic, every single child had some kind of abuse, number one. And number two, by the age of 13, 14, if a child says to you that he has never had any interest in the opposite gender, it's unlikely that's going to happen, whether it came from abuse or not. So you are correct about that's why a child like that, if you know that's an issue, have them talk to a therapist to get the support they need.
you know, just we have a bunch of questions that were submitted. So there's a QR code. Let's look at some of these first, and they can submit their questions. Are coming to me live. So actually, in anticipation of this evening, this variation of this question came up. Several variations of this question. Many kids in our child's class have smartphones. What is the right age to give a child a smartphone with a filter? Perhaps one person suggests, well, maybe when they're 13, merely because just bar mitzvah is a nice threshold, doesn't mean necessarily they're appropriately fit for that. If we don't give it to them, they could possibly get it elsewhere. So the other variations essentially are, if the other kids have it, and I do not feel that my child at 13, for example, is equipped to handle a smartphone, especially without a filter or with a filter, which it's kind of weary. What are your thoughts on this?
I have a lot of thoughts about that, but ultimately that's a question for parents to decide on their own. What do I personally believe? I personally believe it's not a healthy thing to give a child a smartphone before they're 13 for sure. Boys, if they're going into the yeshiva system, I wouldn't give them a smartphone until they're 18 unless they have to travel somewhere and they're going out of town. Give them a smartphone, but give them a smartphone with a proper filter on it, things like that. Having a child have their own smartphone in their pocket with no control whatsoever is absolute no-no. I think what you're giving your kids is a drug, and giving kids a drug, or in Minnesota, I use this example all the time. Minnesota, it's a hunting culture. Parents take the children hunting all the time. And they teach, the kids go out and they use guns, or the kids will go out and use having said that, it's important for your own children to know, for you to know, that the statistics are that 80% of people have had a same-sex physical attraction in their lifetime. 80%, 70%, some very, very high number of people have had in their lifetime a same-sex attraction. And that same-sex attraction, I was shocked when I saw the statistic. I don't know if that's the same way, but my exposure to the Lubavitch, Bochum, and girls world, I think those numbers are reasonable, that boys and girls are having same-sex attraction, and they are believing as a result of that they are gay because they're attracted to another guy at a certain part in time in their life. And it has nothing to do with being gay at all. Thank you for bringing up that topic. Just because a boy says he was attracted, he thinks he's gay, it's not true.
We have a good follow-up question from what you said earlier, but before I proceed, on the chairs around you, so the QR in the center, as you can see, is to submit questions, and then Cash App and Venmo to please contribute to cover the cost of this beautiful event. Obviously, there was a tiny entrance fee just to help cover some costs. You can certainly go above and beyond to help with that. Thank you so much. So one of the things you mentioned earlier, telling a 9-year-old boy that mommy and Tati have a baby by sleeping together isn't going to be sufficient information for them. They're going to ask more detail. Could you give me some guidance? My kid's just not going to stop at that.
If the child is not going to stop and they're asking the question, I believe when a child asks that question, okay, I want to preface this with a famous joke. I think you've all heard it, but I think it's important to share over again. A boy comes home and he says to his mother, "Mommy, you know, I've always wanted to know where I come from." And his mother says, "Oh boy, this is the big question we've always been wondering about." She says to her husband, "You know, Dan, please take care of this. I can't talk about it." So Dad takes him in, has this long conversation, describes how Kadosh Baruch Hu created us, man and a woman. A man has to be together with a woman, and a man has a part of his body which he puts inside the woman, and she passed the seed, just like everybody passes the seed, and that seed grows in her for 9 months, and he goes through the whole thing. And after he finishes, he says to his son, "So now does everything make sense to you?" And the boy says, "No." He says, "I was speaking to Shlomi next door, and he says he comes from New Jersey. I want to know where I come from." So sometimes we share too much information. So we got to be careful about that. That's partially a joke, but partially it's true.
So speaking of too much information, that kind of leads into the next question. Someone said that their 6-year-old said that another 6-year-old in the school showed them their private in the bathroom. So they took that opportunity to explain to their child that, you know, the general talk about private places, but they're just really uncomfortable. What do they do? I'm sure the 6-year-old is not a vicious kid.
I have found a very easy way to talk to children. I heard this from a kindergarten teacher. The kindergarten teacher said correctly that, by the way, we cover ourselves with sneers, but we also cover ourselves because those places are very sensitive. And when you touch them, you can become infected and you can get hurt. And therefore, you should be very careful not to touch those places and always keep them covered. And especially don't let somebody else touch you there because they can pass on germs. This is what she told a 4-year-old child. That's a smart way to talk to a 4-year-old. I mean, I haven't heard any problems with that, but you know, because it's a part of your body which is uncovered, and it's also true. There's a lot of truth in that as a way to talk to a child about keeping the private parts covered. Now you also speak about sneers, just simply the word of sneers, and these are parts of the body which we keep covered. You don't have to say that much more. When you see a child is pushing and he's interested, you do share some basic information. You can share to a child that the tati is the one who has the zera, the seed, and he passes it on to mommy. And you can say, we ask, how does that happen? They lay together in the same bed. How exactly does it happen? You'll find that out older. When you get married, you'll find out about that, and you leave it at that.
So the follow-up would be when to actually elaborate in reality.
So
what age?
If there's no reason to elaborate, you elaborate at the age of 11, 12. If there's a reason to elaborate, if a child has actually seen things or heard things or been exposed to things, it's a good age to talk to a child about that. If your child comes home and has actually watched porn, you need to talk to the child about everything. There's nothing you can hide from that child. Once a child has been exposed to those kind of things, you need to talk to your child about everything because they have to understand the notion of Kedusha. They have to understand the notion that this is about marriage. This is the Kedusha of marriage and why it's unhealthy. Because when two people are just doing it for fun, they are taking something which HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us, a tremendous koyach, a tremendous power, and they're wasting it away. And it demeans later on their ability to get married and to create a kosher home, because the more they do this for fun, later on it's hard just to do it as a mitzvah, etc., etc. And this is a holy thing which is pleasurable, but it's pleasurable for a mommy and a tati. That's a mitzvah which they have to do, not just like that when two people are not married.
So to clarify, you're saying that we should have the, let's call it the full honest conversation of the physiology at age 11 to our children.
Yes. Anybody who believes that they're saving something are making a big mistake. I remember I've spoken to big mechanchim in Chabad who have confirmed that by 12, I don't know about everybody. I remember talking to Rabbi Twersky, I don't know if you know Rabbi Twersky from Alataya, senior Rabbi Twersky, having a conversation with him about this and other rabbonim, that by the age of 12, we are not saving our children from anything by not talking to them about this. Children by the age of 12, 13 need to know about this, ideally through Torah, ideally through when they're learning Gemara, Chumash, when they learn the dinim of a Zav, Zava, a Nida, Keri, Kohen Gadol, Hatatovel was that it says that there was a nest in the Beis Hamikdash, that the Kohen was never Shala'ir Keri B'Yom Kippurim. He was never Keri, never had a nocturnal emission at night. I think that's a great place to start that conversation. That's actually where I start with a lot, to explain to boys that this whole idea of Keri having a nocturnal emission is not an unusual thing. It's actually a nes for it not to happen. Imagine a Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur needed a nes for that not to happen. This is what the Gemara says, one of the nisim. Clearly, that's implies now children need to know this, because if you don't tell it to them, the opposite happens. So by the age of 12, we need to have this. Ideally, parents should be having this conversation. This responsibility is being passed over to teach to the schools, but it is ideally parents who should be having this conversation. It's uncomfortable for parents, and parents today are not always equipped to do that. It is a good idea for the school to have some kind of curriculum, how they introduce these topics in a slow, progressive way from younger ages, what they say at different times, and something which parents have to agree with the school. And, teachers will talk about it when it comes up, as it comes up, what they speak to what they say in 4th grade, how do they translate certain words in the pasuk, how do they translate in 5th grade and in 6th grade, and what they say in 7th grade and when.
It's extremely insightful that you're giving us this clarity of 11 or 12. Your professional view is 11 and 12, because a lot of our discussion was probably about hey, I'm cornered. My kid asked me this very awkward question. Doctor, do me a favor and help me out. This is very insightful. We're talking about a kid who's not curious, not asking. He never particularly cornered you, never teased you with a billboard. You're straight up. You're walking to shul. The kid turned 12 yesterday. Yingala, I got a conversation.
No, don't do it like that. It's not. If you can't, if that's the way you do it, you have that conversation.
Let's talk about if you're not cornered. You're saying 12. You go for it, because it's going to come from someplace else.
Yes, but when I say by you go for it, I mean you find opportunities to bring it up.
Yeah,
and you have the conversation. But yes, by 11 or 12, make it a point to have that conversation. The best one is, kid says to you, the reason is you want him to hear it from you. You don't want him to hear it first from somewhere else. You don't want him to hear this information in an impure way, and then you have to undo what he's heard. Let him first hear it from you, and you will say to him, if you've got any questions, come and ask me.
But I'm just touching on this because it's a powerful point. You're
Absolutely.
saying don't wait for the question.
Don't wait for the
hypothetically, age 12, you didn't hear anything. You fire first. You start the conversation.
Absolutely,
Okay.
before a child puts on tefillin, because that's a great opportunity. You're becoming bar mitzvah next year. You're starting to put on tefillin. Do you know why you're putting on tefillin? You're putting on tefillin because you're becoming an adult. Because as you turn 13, your body is going to grow. Your mind is going to grow. Your Yetzer Tov is going to grow, and your Yetzer Hara is going to grow. And that means your body's going to change. What's going to happen? You're going to notice that things like kishui, you're going to have erections. Probably knows already what that is, because it's happening to him anyway. But you say to him, this happens more and more, and you'll notice that you can, when you think about certain things, it happens more. And that's the way Hashem made it, that's the way it should be. And you start to have this conversation talking about bar mitzvah. You start to talk about buying him tefillin. That's a great opportunity to use the tefillin and his bar mitzvah coming up as an opportunity to talk about what's going to happen to him as a teenager.
Another interesting opportunity is if if your child's in Blue Star Baseball, they have to wear a cup. So that really propels this conversation as well. Just one thought.
Yeah.
Okay, somebody asked a question, a very interesting, very different topic from what we're discussing now. My child is 3. He watches videos many hours a day. We are busy and he wants to watch videos and it's hard to keep him busy with other things. Your thoughts?
3-year-old, whether, I think the what's it called? The Department of Health puts out guidelines, and I think until the age of 5, they say no more than 1 hour. Simply, they are talking about the technology itself. They're talking about the physical effects of looking at a screen are not healthy. 3-year-old child who's exposed to videos from a young age will have either get ADHD or get something called pseudo ADHD. The more a child is watching videos at a young age, they're not capable. What happens is there's research which shows that their attention and their focus gets slowly diminished from long-term watching a screen. And a child under the age of 3 should not be watching videos for longer than about an hour a day. I think it's to the age of 5. Go online, you can see. And then after that, it's from 5 and longer, 2 hours and things like that.
And just to clarify, you're not talking about content. This could be the most
Nothing to do with
holy.
content.
They're watching
Rebbe
Tokyo, Rebbe videos,
It
Jam,
actually
doesn't matter.
affects children because, first of all, there's the stimulation. Something important for people to realize. When a child is watching something on a screen, it is activating their brain in a way which normal life does not do. When I look at you and you're in front of me, it's a static picture. It's not an active picture. When they're looking at a screen, they are watching something which is generated by lights. Those lights, those pixels are going on and off. You don't see it with your conscious eye, but your brain actually perceives it and your brain becomes stimulated. When a child watches a screen, their brain is stimulated. And that stimulation of the brain takes about 45 minutes to calm down. A child who's watching a screen will not be able to fall asleep for about 45 minutes if they've been watching it for a long time. If they are capable of falling asleep, they are sleeping, but they're not able to have proper sleep. And what happens is it short circuits their short-term memory. When a person sleeps, what happens is when you learn something, what happens is you learn it during the day, and after a couple of, you forget it. But when you go to sleep, it moves from the short-term memory into your long-term memory. And that's why healthy sleep helps you remember things. Many studies have been done where they teach people things and they keep them up at night, and they find that those people who kept up at night didn't have proper sleep, could not retain things weeks later when they were given a test. It's very clear that sleep, proper sleep, helps people retain things, retain memory. Non-proper sleep interferes with long-term memory because it doesn't allow short-term memory to go into long-term memory. There are studies which show that when children go to sleep after watching, and it interferes with the ability to sleep properly. So even if they do fall asleep, they're not getting the proper sleep called REM sleep.
What about not watching? What about like audio? Does audio have the same?
No, audio is different.
Okay.
Audio is different.
Okay.
The problem is that if they you want to be careful with these things because you create a dependency. When a child goes to sleep always with audio, then that's what they're always going to need. Kids get used to those things, so be careful with it.
Okay.
Some kids need it because they're not going to fall asleep. They have anxiety and things like that. You need to address it.
This next question is a bit of a hair splitter, if you will. By the way, don't forget about the Venmo and Cash App. So how do we know if our kids are using alcohol as self-medication, or if it's for l'chaim and it's a farbrengen? Because on the one hand, you see your child's participating in farbrengen, having a little bit of l'chaim, and then if it gets a little bit much, yes, you're splitting hairs, but you're the parent. You have to split those hairs. Nobody else is going to do it for you. So what are your recommendations?
Frequency. The only way to know that is by frequency. The first time you see it, your kid drank a little bit too much. And he comes home and he's a little bit tipsy, and you smile and you say, you need to be careful of that because you need to explain to them alcohol does affect the young brain different than it affects an adult brain. There's a reason why adults can drink, children can't. For an adult, the brain is already set pretty much. And so alcohol doesn't affect it as badly. Alcohol does affect the young brain, just like marijuana does. It impedes the brain from growing properly. And it just affects a young brain more than it affects an adult brain. So they need to hear that. But if a child does it once, twice, or on Purim, they get drunk. So like anything else, you tell them, children make bad decisions. But children don't like alcohol naturally. They do not like alcohol. And if your kid's drinking often, you find out that all it calls you up because your child's in the sifta and he's been drinking again and again, there's a problem there. There's definitely a problem going on which needs to be addressed. And it's not the alcohol. This child is self-medicating something.
So you're on one of these.
I get this call, I get all the time. Hanhola members will say to a parent, look, you need your child to speak to somebody, and they'll call me, and I will find that there's either social anxiety or general anxiety or a little bit of depression or something going on in the home, or the child is being bullied, or there's been abuse or something like that, and the child is using the alcohol as a way to escape reality.
So your child, you guys are voice of caring a lot. So your child's 12, 13, 14. You're having one of these growing, mature conversations with them.
Right.
And you're doing kind of what we're doing tonight, a combination of psychology and chassidus and Torah and all of our values. Now we come to a crossroad. So the child, the mashal, let's make up a round number, 14 years old. And hypothetically, they'll get married at 24.
Right.
How are they supposed to, without, what are they supposed to do for the next 10 years to channel their hormones? Are we supposed to tell them, well, it's an issur d'oraisa to masturbate, so that's not a good idea. So this is what you should do for the next 10 years while your hormones are raging. Go.
That's why we have chassidus, for that reason. First of all, there are many, you're asking a very good question. And that's why a lot of secular therapists will say that masturbation is okay, because it's a normal part of the body. First of all, our children are not, let me get back a background. One of the problems with today's generation is that Yiddishkeit does not involve sacrifice. Once upon a time, we raised our children that there was sacrifice when it came to Yiddishkeit. Keeping kosher meant you didn't eat non-kosher food, right? Keeping Pesach meant that you didn't eat chametz. Nowadays, keeping kosher means you got everything you want kosher. And nowadays, keeping chametz, keeping Pesach means you got everything Pesach, except if you're a Lubavitcher and you don't eat schmaltz. But nowadays, the notion that being a Yid involves a certain amount of self-control and self-sacrifice, and that's what makes you into an Erlich Yid, that you don't say yes to everything. There's things that you say no to and things you say yes to. One of the examples you give your children is candies. You walk into a store, and listen, I grew up, there were certain candies we didn't eat. We wanted them and we didn't eat them. There was no such thing as the amount of kosher candy we have today. So the idea of saying no to yourself or saying no to something is an integral part of Yiddishkeit. It's also the power of saying no to klipa is what opens up a person to saying yes to kedusha. The more a person says no, the Rebbe Rashab says, it's very interesting. The Rebbe Rashab says that a bocher who doesn't struggle, I'm going to be very graphic, he doesn't say these words, but the Rebbe Rashab says in Torah Shalom, that a bocher who doesn't struggle with his sexual issues is not shayach to chassidus. Meaning that the energy and the excitement and the attraction to chassidus comes from the recognition that he has to control his nefesh habahamis, that he has to say to his nefesh habahamis, it opens up his mind to kedusha. And I think these are conversations we need to have with our children. Our children need to understand this. Yiddishkeit is not only about no, but if you want to understand things which are holy, you have to separate yourself from the world in some way. And that's what a bacher does. When you're in yeshiva, you keep away from the outside world. You have to say to certain things, no to certain things. And this what gives you ability to appreciate kedusha. When a person's got whatever he wants, there's no way that child is going to be able to experience yeshiva. So we have to raise our children from a young age that this is how you feed your nefesh elokis. That when you're saying no to klipa, it's not just saying no. That saying no to the gashmias is opening up your neshama to ruchnis. We taught our children about a scratch on the neshama. When you scratch the neshama, you taint your neshama every time you eat something, every time you do an aveir, every time you just say yes to yourself, your neshama gets a little bit darker. And when you say no to your nefesh habahamis, your neshama becomes a little bit more pure. If we don't have these conversations with our children, you're right. All we're saying to them is for the next 10 years, no sex, right? You're on a starvation diet, right? But if we explain to them what the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that there's no greater mitzvah. The Alter Rebbe says this in Tanya. There's no greater mitzvah. And by the way, it's a Rashi in Gemara. There's no greater mitzvah than when a person has a taiva, and he says it's specifically taiva of sexuality, and when he says no to it, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has the most joy more than anything else. The Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, he says these words. He says that when a person on a daily basis says no to Yetzer Hara, this is the biggest mitzvah. It's greater than putting tefillin on every day. It's greater than all of these things. And that's why if you see a bacher struggling with this, I make it very clear to a bacher who is struggling with this. Bacher talking, I said, forget about the Chassidish bacher who's learning Chassidus all day. You're the most Chassidish bacher in that yeshiva. The other bachrim are learning Chassidus and doing all their wonderful things because they don't have your taiva. They don't have your energy. And you have this tremendous energy, but this is an energy, if you use it rightly, use it properly, it'll take you to tremendous heights. We have to be able to have these conversations with our boys and with our girls. And if we don't, you're right, all it is saying no to them. So this, hopefully the mashpia may do. Mashpia talk about this and they bring about this with the boys. And unfortunately, if a boy has a smartphone in his pocket and he's watching it all night in his room in yeshiva, he just slowly disconnects. He slowly, like that kid who was playing football. It's not only a ruchnistic thing, it steals away its energy. When a boy masturbates, he's actually giving out his energy. And when he's giving out his energy, that energy would help him concentrate, that energy would help him learn, that energy is motivation, and that motivation goes away. And that is one of the problems, even in marriages we see that if it's not done properly, it steals the motivation, it steals the energy from the person, and it just doesn't feel motivated because he's got everything he needs. It becomes like a drug. Sex becomes a drug. And if we don't have the ability to self-control, just to do it or to do whenever we want to, then the person doesn't become a human being anymore, just becomes an animal. He's just pursuing pleasure all the time. And he loses the ability. It's not only a ruchnistic thing, but we need to be able to have this ruchnistic conversation with our children. If we don't have it, we're not going to win this battle.
That was incredibly insightful. Next question. Bachram always asks, why can't they use marijuana, just like saying l'chaim? It seems to be the exact same thing. Is it perhaps in Neville we had vodka and we have no weed?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that one. I happen to think that yes. I don't know what the big difference between vodka and weed is. I just know the difference between vodka is vodka tastes disgusting. But you can buy nice coolers nowadays, which kids like, and they enjoy that. And you can now get marijuana, which tastes good and is problematic. And we need to have this conversation from a health perspective. Like I said, you can go online and find it out. You just need to talk to them about this is damaging for you. It's just like smoking. And same thing with vaping. I use this example very often. There's some research which shows that, first of all, when you vape in the nicotine, you're getting much more nicotine per vape than you're getting from a cigarette. And the dependence is much stronger. It's not as harmful for certain reasons because it's not damaging, the smoke is not burning out the lungs. But now there's new research which shows that the flavoring which they put into vape is actually causing a phenomenon called popcorn lungs. I don't know if you know what that is. Our lungs are naturally soft and spongy. When you vape, you suck into your lungs chemicals, which are not just oxygen, but designed to give flavor, and they actually enter into the lungs and they coat the outside membrane of the lung. And the more a person does that, it changes the texture of the lung from a spongy texture into a popcorn texture, into a much harder texture, and it causes bronchial problems later on. So people think that vaping doesn't cause damage to the lungs. Long-term vaping is causing damage to people's lungs, not just like cigarettes, but there's more and more evidence coming out, not only from nicotine, simply from the chemicals which they're using in the vape material. And we need to tell this to our children. So we talk about it like everything else. It's a health issue. It's not a truma issue. I think when we make it another religion issue, we're just adding more things on top of the things which they can't do.
But I guess
You talk to them, take them to the doctor, have the doctor talk to them about vaping, have the doctor talk to them about when they get a checkup, say to the doctor, you know, my son is interested in using marijuana. Could you tell him about the health risks of marijuana?
the difference is that your son will come back to you and say, well, in yeshiva, we are being given vodka.
Right.
So to me, it seems kind of similar.
Yeah, that's why we give 3 or 4. We give no more than 4.
So if the doctor says, I prefer 3 to 4 puffs rather than 3 to 4.
Doctor will say alcohol.
Right, that's why I'm telling you about.
Doctors are come out healthy. I don't know. That's so. If we drink wine, there's a,
That's why it's given with the mashpia in the
Yeah.
classroom. It's not done.
you can say to them it's
Bathroom.
part of, yeah, that's exactly. Bocher drinks it in a classroom. It's part of the culture. We only drink 4. You can say that Rebbe himself saw this was a problem, and because it was something which as part of Chassidim used to say l'chaim. We also talk about the importance of l'chaim. There's a difference between mashke and marijuana in terms of what it does to the mind. It takes away inhibition. Marijuana doesn't take away inhibition in the same way, but that's a long conversation.
Okay, I want to squeeze in one more because I know we're coming to a close. By the way, don't
Can I
forget.
add this on?
don't-
I think
What's
that's the
your
right
question?
answer. I think the right answer is just like we drink wine when it's a mitzvah, by Chabad saying l'chaim, it's an old tradition to say l'chaim on mashke, on wine, and that's right. It has to
You
be
don't
done
do it
specifically
yourself.
in small cups and no more than 4.
There's a.
And that's only at a Fabringa.
Nothing.
Just for a second, I got to wrap it up. There's an important question here. So somebody asked a very important question. I'd like to, if you could squeeze this in before the end of the night. What can you do if your teenager, Pasha, doesn't talk to you? You try, the teenager's just not talking to you. I know we're short on time, but the best.
Take away his allowance.
That's a sad issue. It's a sad issue. And first of all, he may not talk to you. He may talk to somebody else. I would recommend first of all, I am very pro therapy. I think therapy is a good thing. I think it's important even if you find the right therapist, and I know that's hard. And a teenager is not talking to you. Maybe he talks to somebody. It doesn't have to be a therapist. It could be a mashpia. It can be a teacher, somebody else. Find somebody else who'll talk to him. And let that person have an influence on them. Find out who that person is. Or I would recommend find a way to take this child out to say, you want to go, I'm actually working with a couple in Crown Heights where this girl, is unfortunately not going to school, not talking to her parents. So her mother started with my coaching to take her out to a restaurant. Take her out to eat. You want to go out to eat? Go out to eat. You want to go out to a ball game? Once in a while, take him out to the ball game and use that as an opportunity just to begin chatting. And sometimes, because if the conversation is always, sometimes it might simply be the child doesn't feel understood. I think a lot of times our interaction with our children is to share information with them, to tell them things, to correct them, to teach them. But sometimes our children just want us to listen. And if we listen 10 times before we speak once, our children will learn to talk to us. But I think what we do is we believe that every opportunity we have has to be a teaching moment. I don't think every opportunity for us and our children needs to be a teaching moment. I think every opportunity with our children needs to be a learning moment. There's a difference between a learning moment and a teaching moment. A learning moment means our children are watching and they're learning something from us. Teaching moment means that we're actively preaching to them. And children today don't like to be preached to.
Dr. Shagalow, on behalf of the National Los Angeles, we really thank you so much for coming.